cases. But we also know that it takes accountability within the justice system itself, right, in order for people to make the right decisions based on that video evidence. I would also say we do know that there are problems with people who have body cameras, right, who have body camera evidence and either refuse to turn that evidence over to the public, or refuse to show that evidence to the public, or refuse to turn their body cameras on so that we have that evidence for discussion and for conversation and as part of the evidentiary body. So, we have to think about this far more holistically than we already are. It's not enough simply to have the video evidence. It's also how we interpret it, how we use it, and what kind of access that we get to it as a public community and as a nation.
And part of the solution there, thanks, Leah, is as Bob Boyce was saying, within police departments themselves. And I'd like to bring in another law enforcement voice here. Sonia Pruitt spent decades as a Montgomery County Maryland police officer, and she's the founder of the Black Police Experience as well, an activist group, and has been with us throughout this trial. And Sonia's joining us by phone. And I want to ask you, Sonia, it felt a little bit like maybe the thin blue line cracked in this case. The police chief of Minneapolis, Madaria Arradondo, testified against his former officer. Other officers stepped forward to take the witness stand and testified against him as well. They had an expert police witness from the Los Angeles Police Department come into court and testify against Derek Chauvin. So it's something that hasn't been seen that much. Do you think there is a change happening in the culture of policing, in part because of what's happened here?
Good afternoon. And, the answer to that question for me is that remains to be seen. I would love to be hopeful because I am an eternal optimist. But the reality is this. We've had moments in our policing history that we thought forced change. Rodney King forced us to look at use of force training. Michael Brown forced us to wear body-worn cameras. George Floyd, here we are again. We're making a case for consistent use of force training and parameters nationwide. That's what I think will happen after the verdict is read, and hopefully it is conviction on all three counts. But here is the sneaky elephant in that room. That sneaky elephant is systemic racism. We have had multiple reports since January 6th, and even before that, about nationalists joining police forces. The Oath Keepers said that they're getting training from active police officers. When are we as a nation going to have a reckoning about systemic racism in policing and how it is affecting Black and brown people and other vulnerable communities? When we do that, then maybe we can make some really, really big forward steps. But until then, we are just going to be spinning our wheels, in my opinion.
All right. Sonia Pruitt, thanks for that. And we have some live images, I understand, from outside the courthouse. The city of Minneapolis has been preparing for this moment. Thousands of National Guard troops have been deployed throughout the city. The governor of Minnesota also issued a state of emergency, trying to prepare for the prospect of unrest, depending on how this verdict comes down. And again, that's a live shot of the Hennepin County Courthouse. And I want to go to Matt Stone, who was actually there in the courtroom yesterday as the attorneys delivered their closing statements. And Matt, we can see the witnesses in this case, and at some points we could see the judge, we could see the attorneys, we could see Chauvin, but we couldn't see the jury throughout this entire trial. So paint the picture for us a little bit about how the jury was reacting over the course of this more than 6 hours of closing arguments from both sides.
Hey, Diane, I mean, you hit the nail on the head. You had an extremely long closing argument from both the prosecution and from Derek Chauvin's attorney, Eric Nelson. I felt like they were a little bit more engaged during the testimony or during the closing argument from the prosecution, a little bit more fresh. It was earlier on in the day. And of course, we all saw as Eric Nelson continued to go on, the judge interrupted him. we kind of hit a log in the afternoon where there hadn't been a lunch break. The jury had only been excused for 20 minutes at a certain point. So you could really see on their faces that they were getting a little bit flustered, not just because of the length of the closing argument, but also I believe that a lot of what Eric Nelson was saying, there were especially two women in the front. Based on my view, they were sitting to the left, basically would be right in front of the judge's left, who were shaking their heads a couple of times at the points that Eric Nelson was making. So I do believe, obviously, with the verdict now in, that could be a clue to where this ends up. But of course, with the pandemic, they're wearing masks, so it is difficult to see, are they smiling? I'm just reading their eyebrows, their facial expressions. It's very difficult to kind of see exactly what they're saying. Obviously, 14 jurors in the room, 12 were excused. It's a very diverse group. But for the most part, they were engaged. And I think, as I mentioned yesterday, regardless of what the decision is that we'll hear in a couple of hours, I do believe that they left, they went through everything, all the elements, all the exhibits, and, I believe this is a jury that did a pretty good job in terms of coming to a decision. And of course, we'll see what that is shortly.
Yeah, and Matt, you mentioned how the jury is wearing masks, as were most of the people in the courtroom, so it can be hard sometimes to read their facial expressions. But we were showing video just a few seconds ago of Derek Chauvin, who was also wearing a mask throughout the course of this entire trial until his attorney started delivering closing arguments. And then for the first time throughout the course of this trial, we saw Derek Chauvin remove his mask. What was that moment like in the courtroom?
It's funny, I was on with David and actually was running back in as he was taking off the mask. And I think the jury understood what the moment meant from the defense's side. They were obviously trying to humanize Derek Chauvin. Obviously they did not really know that much about him coming in. Clearly that's why they were picked to be on a fair and impartial jury. But they kind of all stared at him, and there was a lot of jurors who their eyes were focused on him throughout a lot of Eric Nelson's testimony, closing argument. They were locked in on Chauvin to see if he had any reaction. He's a very stoic man. Anytime there had been any video exhibits played by the prosecution, he would not look. He would look down at his notes. He had a notepad that he was taking notes throughout the entire trial. We saw it each day. But when his attorney, Eric Nelson, showed video or showed any sort of images on the screen, he was looking and he was taking in that information.
Thank you, Matt, for that eyewitness account. These jurors have that fate of the one man, the defendant in that courtroom, and his attorney obviously trying to make some connection there between this individual, Derek Chauvin, and the people who hold his fate in their hands and have reached a decision on that. Let me go back to Kenneth Moten in Minneapolis. The jury here, there was a feeling that it was more or less representative of Hennepin County, that jury pool predominantly white, as is the jury. What's the general feeling there about the jury, do you think?
The general feeling is that this jury had a lot of work to do, and a lot of eyes, a lot of pressure was on this jury as well. And so you mentioned kind of this jury and the makeup of this jury, and we know that it started out with 15. There were two alternates. Two of them were dismissed as soon as the deliberations started. And so we know that it's majority white, but there are also 4 people who identify as Black, 6 people of color. So when it comes to this jury, everyone is wondering, obviously, what were those deliberations like? What was happening inside that room? Again, 10 and a half hours or so when it comes to the amount of time they were deliberating. They had to go through jury instructions. They had to go through essentially worksheets of each of those charges: second-degree unintentional, third-degree murder, second-degree manslaughter as well, and go through the evidence. They had mountains of evidence when it comes to video, surveillance video, police body camera video, that cell phone video, that 9 minutes, 29 seconds that everyone, the world really has seen as well. And Diane, I really want to, you guys have asked me over the course of this trial as well, what are the people on the streets? What are they saying? What are the people of Minneapolis saying in this area? And yes, the people on the streets are obviously, they're demanding justice. They're angry. They're upset, like most people who saw that video. But I also spoke with essentially anyone I could talk with here in Minneapolis, the people at the restaurants, the waiters, the host also that was seating me. I wanted to know what they were thinking. And actually, even on the flight here over the weekend, I talked to a woman who was sitting right next to me. She's from Minneapolis. She's a middle-aged woman, white woman, in her 50s. She showed me images on her phone of the community. She works at a nearby hospital near 38th in Chicago. She was saddened to see businesses boarded up, burned out businesses from the riots that happened last summer after the May 25th incident. She called Chauvin a knucklehead who just needs to accept the consequences of his actions. She believes that he won't get second degree, that she won't be found guilty of second degree murder. She believes that no matter what happens, that people won't be satisfied with this verdict as well. She worries about her community and feels it's going downhill, wants business owners to be able to open their stores again. So that gives you a little flavor, a little touch of what people here in Minneapolis is feeling. Even after that verdict happens, they're still worried about their community.
I want to go back, Kenneth, thank you. I want to go back to former NYPD Chief of Detectives, Robert Boyce, for a little more on how the law enforcement community is viewing all of this. Because, Robert, we heard the prosecutors say that there's nothing worse for good police than bad police, and how the police are not on trial here. Derek Chauvin is on trial. But we've also heard over the years a lot about the thin blue line and a lot about how law enforcement, the community of law enforcement officers, tends to stick together. So overall, how is the law enforcement community viewing and reacting to this case?
Diane, I think from when this initial happened about a year ago, we took a look at this, and I asked everybody in law enforcement that I knew, and everyone, to a person, to an individual person, was repulsed by that video. Everyone. And it hurts law enforcement. It hurts our ability to deal with the public. It gives us a bad image. Just this past week, officers were assaulted with Molotov cocktails in New York. So it sends a message that, that now we have to watch out for ourselves, because there's going to be people on the fringes of society who are going to try to hurt us when they see this message. So we are concerned. I don't know anybody who supported that video when they saw it. That was a long trial. And I hope this is a reckoning that this is over, that we're going to move forward and we'll get back to proper, well-trained law enforcement, intelligently executed in the street. So hopefully this is an end of things and we can go forward. I am concerned about tonight, no matter what happens with the verdict or where it goes, and we think we know where it's going now, but I'm still concerned about what might happen later on in my city and cities across the nation.
For all those officers on the street trying to do it right. Let me go to Leah Wright-Rigueur on this question. Leah, there is a lot of talk about reimagining police in America, reconstructing how we approach the issue of public safety. For a long time, perhaps, it did feel to a lot of people as if there was a militarization of our police. And having lived overseas, there's no question we have a very different kind of policing in America, perhaps because we need it. We are a more violent society than they do in other places. But do you think that is actually happening, reimagining policing in America? What might it look like?
Sure. So I think one thing to keep in mind is that the United States is really unique in a lot of regards, in that we incarcerate more people, right, per capita than any other nation in the world, particularly amongst developed nations in the world. We also have a very different kind of policing and police force that is far more violent, I think, than any other nation in the developed world. So we're unique in that respect. What I do think that we are beginning to see, and this actually exists irrespective of the outcome of today's trial, of the Chauvin trial, is that people are beginning to say, I can reimagine, or I can imagine a world where policing is not right at the center of how we engage communities. It's not at the center of, or a carceral state is not at the center of how things work within this country. That if we have a social problem, the people that we call shouldn't necessarily be the police, because the police aren't trained in handling these kinds of things. And I think it's not simply the George Floyd moment that drove us there. But instead, in the ensuing months that were subsequent to the George Floyd moment, proved that the United States and policing had a significant problem that couldn't be solved even after a man was killed on television. So I think part of what we're beginning to see is that in a nation that still continues to kill Black people, we have to find imaginative and creative ways to really solve this problem.
All right, Leah Wright-Rigor, thanks for that. Again, the jury in the trial against Derek Chauvin has now reached a verdict. After 10 and a half hours of deliberating, they will determine whether Derek Chauvin will be convicted of killing George Floyd. We're awaiting that verdict now at any minute. Here's David Muir.
This is an ABC News special report. The death of George Floyd. Derek Chauvin on trial. Now reporting, David Muir.
Good afternoon. We're coming on the air at this hour because a verdict has been reached in the trial of former Minneapolis police officer Derek Chauvin. Closing arguments, of course, just 24 hours ago from both sides. The jury then given instructions late yesterday. They began deliberating. And again this morning, continuing with those deliberations. And now their decision expected at any moment in Minneapolis. Of course, we know that Chauvin is charged with the death of George Floyd, the country watching, the world watching those images. Chauvin with his knee to George Floyd's neck. It prompted an almost immediate reckoning in this country on race, justice, and policing in America. The prosecution focused on those 9 minutes, 29 seconds, and in their closing argument, reminding the jury of the 9-year-old girl, one of the witnesses, the bystanders, who said she heard paramedics 9 minutes later saying, "Get off of him." They said, "Believe what you see." The defense saying it was about more than those 9 minutes, trying to sow doubt in the jury's minds. The jury deliberating for 10 and a half hours, 4 hours last night, 6.5 hours today. Chauvin facing charges of second-degree unintentional murder, third-degree murder, and second-degree manslaughter. We heard his voice in that courtroom when he invoked his Fifth Amendment right last week not to take the stand in his own defense. Today, we learned President Biden called George Floyd's family yesterday. The president suggesting today that the evidence is, quote, overwhelming, and saying, quote, "I'm praying that the verdict is the right verdict." And the president adding he was only sharing those words because he knew the jury was sequestered and had begun their work. About 2,000 National Guard members on duty in Minneapolis, police in cities across the country on alert as well. And our entire team is standing by with us this afternoon as we await the verdict in the trial of that former Minneapolis police officer. I want to bring in our chief legal analyst, Dan Abrams, to start our coverage here. And Dan, conventional wisdom, they say it's made to throw it out. But in this case, there were no questions from the jury, no confusion over the charges, no notes sent to the judge, a relatively short amount of time to deliberate.
Yeah, you have to be very nervous if you're Derek Chauvin right now. First of all, because a hung jury is off the table. We now know that this jury is unanimous. And the fact that they didn't ask questions would again suggest that it's more likely, if you were sort of following the way these things go, that it's going to be the highest charge in this case. Why? Because if it was going to be a manslaughter, let's say, for example, you would expect that there might have been more debate about the definitions and discussions about third-degree murder versus manslaughter, etc. For a high-profile case, this is a pretty fast verdict. Some people will tell you, wait a sec, 10 hours plus, that's not so fast. That's true, but in high-profile cases, when the world is watching, the jurors typically want to cross the T's and dot the I's and make it clear to the world that they very carefully considered the evidence. So the fact that they have already come back here with so little coming from the jury has got to be very frightening news for Derek Chauvin right now.
All right, Dan Abrams with us as we await this verdict. Dan, stick with us here. I want to bring Sunny Hostin into this conversation, a former prosecutor herself, ABC News legal analyst, of course, co-host of The View. And Dan makes a good point there, Sunny, about these jurors obviously knowing the weight of this case and that the nation is watching them. And I just want to remind our viewers at home what Judge Cahill said when he was delivering instructions to the jurors. He said, "Do not let bias, prejudice, passion, sympathy, or public opinion influence your decision, and warning them not to consider what consequences their verdict might have. And the fact that they've deliberated for such a short window, what does that signal to you?
Well, conventional wisdom does tell you that fast verdicts hint at agreement. And I will tell you that in all of the cases that I tried, and there were many, especially in the criminal context, what you want as a prosecutor is a fast verdict, because when there are no questions, when there are no clarifications asked by a jury for jury instructions, when you have nothing to read from the jury, a fast verdict like this indicates that there is a full agreement. I am very surprised, actually, that they reached an agreement in such a high-profile case with 45 witnesses in just a little over 10 hours. That is very unusual in a case like this with 12 jurors. Sometimes in a civil case, yes, you get fast verdicts, but in this kind of case, it is very unusual. I actually was expecting many questions. I was expecting some questions about legal clarification, jury instructions, clarifications. And I was actually, David, also expecting what we call the Allen charge, which is, okay, I understand that you are stuck. I understand that there's disagreement, but I want you to go back and do your best and come to an agreement. I was fully expecting something like that. And obviously that did not happen. The jury has reached an agreement. That's unusual.
Sonny Hostin with us this afternoon. Sonny, underscoring that point that there was not one question from the jury, not one point of contention or query to the judge about confusion over any of the charges, which, as Sonny suggests, points to agreement within the jury, obviously, given the short amount of time that they were deliberating. You're looking at a live picture of Minneapolis. We should mention that those images from inside the courtroom, that was during the course of the trial and the closing arguments. There is no live stream yet up and running from that courtroom. And we should also remind all of you at home that the reason there's a live stream in this case is because we find ourselves not only in this moment, this conversation, this racial reckoning in this country, but also in the middle of a pandemic. The judge deciding to make that rare choice to live stream this trial because he knew that members of the community and members of George Floyd's family would not allow to be in that courtroom given the restrictions on the number of people they're actually allowing inside that court. But in turn, in deciding to live stream the trial, that means the country can watch, the world can watch, and they are waiting for this verdict as well. I want to bring in ABC's Alex Perez, who's been on the ground in Minneapolis since this case began. And Alex, what's the temperature there in Minneapolis? I know it seems relatively calm, although the National Guard on scene, and they are preparing for this verdict as well.
Well, David, they've been preparing for weeks now for this verdict. Yes, there's those 2,000 members of the National Guard sort of scattered all around town. If you look around the downtown area here, most of the businesses are boarded up. People just did not want to take any chances. We remember those protests, those violent protests that happened here last summer, and people are afraid that they want to be ready for any sort of verdict to come. Now, David, we also want to talk about the jury. You know, we've been focusing on every single thing that they've done, and this is a group of jurors that has been taking notes every day during this trial. It was noted that they were attentive, that they were seemed inquisitive and paying attention to the experts who testified. And, you know, it's really hard to read the tea leaves in a situation like this. But one of the things that I noted yesterday, just in covering trials, yesterday the jury started deliberating very late, and they stayed an extra hour. Even after a long day, they stayed an extra hour. And this morning, they started deliberating about 90 minutes early. And to me, that seemed to indicate that perhaps they were close to reaching something and wanted to work on it. And now we know they have reached some sort of decision, and we're going to learn that decision very soon. And as we await that decision, David, I think about my conversation with Terrence Floyd, George Floyd's brother. And I remember he was in so much pain right after this incident happened. And one of the things he said to me was that seeing this case through, all the way through a conviction, was something that his family wanted for and would continue to fight for until they saw it. So they could have an answer to that very soon, David.
Alex Perez in Minneapolis. Alex, thank you. That was a live picture there of Minneapolis, South Minneapolis, not far from the scene where this all began to unfold about a year ago, Memorial Day last year, of course, the corner of Chicago and 38th Street there in front of the Cup Foods in South Minneapolis, George Floyd Square, as it's now called. I want to bring in Lindsay Davis because, Lindsay, you and I have talked so much about this case. We've been on the air together all along the way, and it's so rare that this country takes a sort of deep breath together to watch one of these moments come in. But this is one of those moments, given the reckoning, the conversation in this country. And I think that we were all struck a year ago, and then the continuing protests and conversations over the course of the year, the diversity in the faces of the people out in the streets, small towns, large cities, somewhat reassuring, I know, to the Floyd family as well, to see the diversity of the people supporting them and this conversation about policing and justice in America.
That's right. So many collectively holding their breath here, David. You can perhaps hear the helicopters above. I know that we just saw the crowds outside of Cup Foods at 38th in Chicago, but just a kind of scene set for you here, just a few blocks away from the courthouse in downtown Minneapolis, it's eerily quiet. You know, there are a few cars, but very few people out on the road. I went for a walk today just to kind of get a temperature and feel of the people. Happened to just come in contact with one man. He happened to be a black man. I said, so what do we think? And he said, I think if they come back quick, we got him. And he had a personal pride. He was invested, some skin in the game. He kind of felt that he was taking this on certainly personally with regard to whatever the verdict would be. I was thinking about the jurors as well. I mean, there's people from all walks of life. You have 3 who are in their 20s, ranging in age. You have 1 woman who goes into her 60s, and 6 who identify as people of color, 3 of them black men. You have one who's a social worker, accountant, a chemist, a banker, a nurse. And we did get a lot of color during the jury selection about their thoughts on race and social justice and criminal justice. There was a white man who was very clear. He said, look, I believe all lives matter. You had a black man who said that when he had seen the video, he had told his wife that could have been me. And so going into this, they allowed these jurors that have these diverse opinions and backgrounds and experiences and perspectives. And then you had just a few days before before the trial culminated, the fatal shooting of Dante Wright, which the defense obviously wanted them to be sequestered and not hear that, but the judge allowed them to hear that, and so you have to wonder, were they at all impacted by that, and were they able to just focus on this as an isolated incident, or did they look at the historical injustice of all of this? Additionally, they knew about the $27 million settlement. This was the largest pretrial settlement in America's history for this kind of a civil rights death. And so a lot going into what those jurors brought into this and what they thought as it all played out in real time.
We can hear the choppers overhead there in Minneapolis. Our thanks to Lindsay Davis, and we'll be checking back in with you over the course of this afternoon. These are live pictures on the ground there in South Minneapolis. Relative calm, as you can see, in this community and in so many communities across this country. I think people in their smartphones have heard that there is a verdict, the judge revealing that and saying that the verdict would be delivered in about an hour. That was a little more than an hour ago, so we are expecting that jury at any time. And Lindsay talking about the diversity of the members of that jury. And I know we have that graphic that actually breaks down members of the jury, if we have a moment to bring that back up, just to help folks at home understand that the jury selection was something that both sides so carefully spent time on in this case. Members of the jury, 5 men, 7 women, ages from 20 to 60 years old, 4 black jurors, 6 white jurors, and 2 jurors who self-identify as multiracial. One of the jurors, for example, a white woman in her 50s, she works as a nurse. She assured the court that even though she had seen a portion of that viral video, that the video of George Floyd on the ground, that she could be impartial. And she acknowledged that we all bring life experience to the jury if we are selected, and talked about how her background as a nurse could potentially help her make decisions in this case. I want to bring in Nightline anchor Byron Pitts, who's been covering this right along with us from the very beginning. And Byron, I mentioned this a moment ago in talking with Lindsay, the diversity of the faces of the families across this country who wanted justice after seeing that video themselves. And this has really been almost a year-long conversation in this country about how we move forward.
You're so right, David. And that's why this moment is so different from other moments in American history, where we've seen instances where Black America went in one direction and white America seemed to go someplace else. In this particular moment, this case, the reaction seemed to be universal. The people of all stripes reacted in a very passionate way to the death of George Floyd. And David, I'm struck by something that you said earlier, that this is a deep breath moment for our nation. I think you're absolutely right. You think about these kinds of trials. I was looking at that trial, the 4 police officers in Los Angeles in 1992, the O.J. Simpson trial in 1995. This day is one of those moments where many Americans will hold their breath to see what happens. And David, I think in many ways we may have two verdicts today. We will have the verdict of this jury, this diverse jury, and then the hours and days to come, we will have the verdict of the American people. One can imagine that however it goes, a portion of America will see that justice was served. A portion of America will say that justice missed its mark. And I think while we wait for this verdict, it'll also be curious to see, and I think that's why we see the law enforcement presence in Minneapolis and other major cities across this nation, as we all, David, as you said, hold our breath waiting for this verdict.
And of course, Byron, no one wants to get ahead of themselves as far as this verdict is concerned. We do know that the relatively short amount of time and the weight of this case, as we heard from Sonny Hostin earlier, signals that there was agreement and fairly early on within that jury that was sequestered immediately after those closing arguments, immediately after getting instructions from the judge who asked them not to bring their bias into that decision making, but also not to worry or be concerned with how the country and the world would react to their decision, because after all, the live stream showed the rest of us what transpired in that courtroom, with the exception of the jurors themselves. We all got to watch, but we didn't see the folks who will actually make this decision, who were there from day one during this trial. I want to bring in Terry Austin from Law and Crime, the network that covers this. She's been covering this case, obviously, for the better part of a year. And Terry, I wanted to remind people at home, as we await this decision from the jury, what the prosecution was up against here. They had to convince beyond reasonable doubt that Derek Chauvin's actions, his knee to the neck, was a substantial cause of George Floyd's death. Not the only cause, but a substantial one.
That's exactly right. And I think the jury did boil it down to two issues. That issue that you just mentioned, the fact that there was unreasonable use of force, and that the substantial cause of the death was that unreasonable use of force. So they narrowed it down, and I think they came to a quick decision based on all of the evidence. And we had multiple witnesses who talked about this use of force. And of course, we had Chief Arredondo, who was pivotal in stating not only was this unreasonable use of force, but this was against policy and it was not showing the duty of care. The other issue that clearly the jury came to a very swift conclusion was the fact that the cause of death was the knee, and it was unreasonable. And so they listened to all the medical evidence. They listened to all of the evidence from the police officers. They cut to the chase. I'm sure they did consider the different elements that the judge talked about as far as the second degree, third degree, and manslaughter. But I think they narrowed it down to what Jerry Blackwell said on his rebuttal, which was this: use the 46th witness on the stand, which is your common sense. If you believe that, in fact, what you saw on this video was unreasonable force and that the knee on the back and the neck caused the death, then you have to come back with the guilty verdict. And I do believe that's exactly what they did.
Well, we'll wait and see for that, because we also know that the defense spent 3 hours yesterday in its closing argument from defense attorney Eric Nelson to try to sow doubt among that jury, continuing with what he had done over the course of the trial. bringing up past drug use of George Floyd, his heart condition, asking was there the potential of any carbon monoxide from that patrol car? Did bystanders distract Derek Chauvin while he was right there at that scene with his knee to George Floyd's neck for 9 minutes, 29 seconds? And the defense attorney trying to make the case that this particular trial is about more than those 9 minutes, that the jurors, when they deliberate, should be thinking about, as he said, the 16 minutes that came before and what Chauvin came upon when he arrived at that scene. He tried to use images of them putting George Floyd into the patrol car, 3 officers trying to do that to no avail, to try to make the case that those were all factors that Derek Chauvin took into account in those 9 minutes. Of course, then the rebuttal from the prosecution making the point that over the course of those 9 minutes, he certainly had time to react to what he was presiding over during those 9 minutes, and direct reaction to the carbon monoxide suggestion, saying if that were in fact the case, that the carbon monoxide was coming from the police patrol car. So he should have been aware of that too. So we saw a back and forth between the prosecution and the defense as they made their closing arguments yesterday. I want to bring in Kenneth Moulton from Minneapolis. Kenneth was on the air with us yesterday as we were covering these closing arguments. I know that you have been in touch with George Floyd's family and his family's representation, Ben Crump and others, for their reaction to the prosecution's closing argument, and then the defense once we heard the 3 hours of their closing argument. And I'm curious if you're hearing anything in the last 24 hours and to the development of this last hour.
David, they are gathered in a hotel here in downtown Minneapolis. The words we're hearing right now at this hour, they're optimistic. They are in good spirits, but they're also anxious, eager, nervous as we await this verdict here. Also, we know that when it comes to this Floyd family, that in the past 10, 11 months or so, since the death of George Floyd, this family has gone through a lot. Yes, they got a $27 million settlement, but they lost this loved one, this person they knew, who they watched in this video die at the knee of Derek Chauvin. And so for this family, they've gotten the good and the bad, David. They have gotten a lot of support, but they've also heard from the critics who believe that George Floyd shouldn't have resisted, that he was on drugs, that he was somehow at fault. But they've got a number of supporters, people who have been in these streets. And so Floyd, the brother of George Floyd, has said that he is urging for peace and calm after this verdict is read, but he knows that he can't control the anger on these streets for those people who are hitting the streets. And really, David, for this family, for months now, they have watched this country go through a racial reckoning. They've watched this country change, in many industries change because of this racial reckoning. But they truly feel that today, with this verdict, that today is their day of reckoning. David?
Kenneth Moulton in Minneapolis, and the family all along has asked for peace and calm across this country, something Terrence Floyd told me almost a year ago in Brooklyn, that they were deeply moved by the diversity of the faces in these protests across the country, but saying any sort of violence is not what their brother would have wanted. I want to bring in our senior national correspondent, Steve Osunsami, of course, following the case as well. And Steve, as you and I were on the air yesterday during these closing arguments, we heard the prosecution say this is not an anti-police prosecution, that this is the case of Derek Chauvin, one lone officer in this particular trial. We know other officers will come later, perhaps later this summer, but this case is about Derek Chauvin, they said. And what was fascinating in this trial, and somewhat rare, as you know, Steve, is that sort of blue wall came down. There were a number of police witnesses that they used to make this case, and they put up a graphic during their closing argument, the prosecution just showing just the significance of the number of police witnesses who came forward and said this action was not justified.
That's right, David. And chief among them was this officer's former boss. You had a prosecutor saying that this wasn't policing, this was murder, that this was a shocking abuse of authority, that you cannot justify what everyone saw in that videotape. And I want to share just a little bit of inside baseball. You know, Byron alluded to the Rodney King incident. You know, there are a lot of people saying that the only difference between what happened in the Rodney King incident, where those officers walked away, and what is happening here is the improved quality of the videotape. You know, this verdict could prove that line wrong, or it could underline it. So a lot of people, especially in Black America, are waiting to see, will this happen again? Will what we see with our own eyes be rejected by a jury? And I'll tell you, some of the arguments that we were hearing from the defense in this case, that this was I call it the super black defense, you know, a big black man who was super strong and had some chemicals that were assisting him in his strength. You know, we've heard many of those arguments before in some of these other cases. The Walter Scott case in South Carolina, people forget that was another case where you saw a police officer shoot a black man in the back. It was on camera, and that officer was not acquitted in state court. And in fact, when we polled the jury, you know, we expected there was probably one holdout, and that's what the defense in this case is hoping for, just one. But in that case, there were two, and one of the holdouts was African American. So you just never know what you're going to get from these cases, what the jury is hearing, how they process the information. And, you know, one thing I want to underline that the prosecution, as you pointed out, was very big about, was they wanted to make sure that this wasn't an anti-police case. They wanted to underline to any jurors out there that this isn't about punishing cops. This is about punishing a bad cop. And that was the message that they were really trying to underline, and that we'll see if it has gotten across to the jurors in this case.
It's so important to point out, Steve, that we simply do not know what this jury has decided. All we do know is that they have come to a verdict in a relatively short amount of time. As Steve mentioned there, the defense, what they try to do is, of course, sow some doubt in the mind of at least one juror to hold up the verdict, to get them to deliberate even longer, to get one of the jurors to make other jurors question in that deliberation room. But that does not appear to be the case, obviously, in this trial. To reach a verdict of guilty or not guilty, all 12 jurors need to agree on a charge. And that is what we have here. We simply don't know what their decision is in this case. And I want to bring in Terry Moran, because Terry, we were talking there with Byron and with Steve and Lindsay a little earlier about the diversity of faces, the wide swath of Americans. It sort of was the fabric of America that we watched over the course of the last year. People who looked at that video and then had to have that conversation with their children at home, and we saw the 9-year-old witness in this case who said she heard paramedics say, "Get off of him." Children often know, when they look at an image at least, what they believe is right or wrong.
They do, David. And Prosecutor Jerry Blackwell used the testimony of that 9-year-old girl, a minor witness not identified by name in this trial, to make the case to the jury. She got it right. And it's the feeling that we all had when my own then 7-year-old daughter asked my wife what had happened. She'd heard something about it, and my wife had explained it to her. She burst into tears. And that's the wisdom of a 7-year-old, too. And I think one of the things, having covered trials where police officers are on trial in the past, our country has, as we know, a bad history in many ways with these. Something felt different to me in this one. The first eyewitnesses, the bystander eyewitnesses, that 9-year-old girl, her cousin Darnella Frazier, who took the videotape, Charles McMillan, who was the elder, the mayor of that community, who took the witness stand and burst into tears. The whole world saw that video. They saw the event, and they brought us even closer to that experience of horror that we all had in watching that. The other thing that felt different, the thin blue line shattered in this case. The chief of police, Medaria Arradondo of Minneapolis, took the stand against his former officer. So did other officers in that department, took the witness stand and testified for the prosecution against Derek Chauvin. A police officer, an expert witness from the Los Angeles Police Department, came across the country. Lawyers I talked to said they'd never seen anything like it. So there was something different in this trial. The reckoning of the uprising that happened in our streets, I think, was felt in that courtroom, and not in an illegitimate way, in a true way.
Terry, stick with us here as we look at live pictures from Minneapolis, the people at that community, and really across this country now. So many have had the chance to be alerted through social media or on their phone that the verdict has been reached. One of those very rare moments in this country, as I mentioned earlier, when people will come to the TV or wherever they can get their information to find out what the decision will be from these jurors. But Terry, you bring up a good point. There was something about this trial, a number of things that were different from what we've seen in the past. But one of the things that was I took note of was the fact that both sides tried to make bias an issue. We heard from the prosecution about the bias that we're all raised to believe that police officers, and the vast majority of them do, try to protect and serve their community, but that we should not think about police as a whole, but about this specific officer. That was what the prosecution said to the jurors as they were prepared to go in and then deliberate his fate. On the flip side of that, we heard the closing argument yesterday that the defense attorney for Derek Chauvin saying, don't be biased with everything that they have presented in this case. You must keep in mind what Derek Chauvin saw and heard when the dispatch call first came in, what he saw when he arrived on the scene in those 16 minutes before those crucial 9 minutes that the country and the world saw. But he tried to make the case you must think about the information that he gathered in his head in the 16 minutes prior. And he tried to introduce the bystanders, the witnesses, as a form of distraction. And at some points, he tried to make the case that there was a potential danger from people there in the community. Those two very different arguments over bias. And I'm curious if it struck you and which argument carried greater weight.
It did, and I think you're exactly right on what the defense was trying to do there by in South Chicago, 38th in Minneapolis, 38th in Chicago and Minneapolis, a very diverse neighborhood, trying to communicate to the jurors, well, Derek Chauvin had a legitimate concern because, there were people from that neighborhood on the street. But the problem was we heard from them. The jurors heard from them, and they saw the picture of them, and they heard what they were trying to do. They were trying to stop what they thought was an atrocity. And I think one of the things that the defense had such a hard problem with is that I think every decent American, every patriotic American recognizes that we have had a problem in this country. We've had a problem with the use of force against black bodies and black people. And that's not to say that a person like Derek Chauvin can't get a fair trial. It is to understand that the history here, has resulted in bad verdicts. And the jury has that history in their hearts, as we all do. And that, I think, is how they're going to address those claims of bias on both sides. Their job is to look at the evidence against this man and the law in this case. But they speak for the community, for their local community, and for all of us.
Terry Moran with us from our Washington Bureau. Terry, thank you. As we continue to look at pictures, these are the aerial pictures, of course, from Minneapolis coming in. There's also pictures from South Minneapolis, right in front of the Cup Foods, the scene of horror, really, witnessed by the entire world because of the video that was captured that day. And you can see the vigil there for George Floyd, the images of George Floyd and people gathering. Very calm scenes across this country, as we have mentioned here. No one wants to get ahead of themselves. We have no idea what the jury has decided. All we know at this point, for those of you just joining us for a live coverage, 5 p.m. Eastern, is that the judge in this case, Judge Cahill in Minneapolis, has revealed that the jurors have reached a verdict in the trial of former Minneapolis police officer Derek Chauvin, who has been charged with 3 charges, as we know, in the death of George Floyd. We will learn from the jury momentarily. He said in about an hour. That would have been about 30 minutes ago, but we do know that they were sequestered in a hotel in Minneapolis. You have to factor in the idea that they would be brought, and there's high security in this case, to the Hennepin County courtroom, several floors up in that office building in downtown Minneapolis, where we had seen the fencing and the significant presence of the National Guard, though luckily, and we have not seen any reason for that security up until this point. And of course, everyone waiting to hear what the jury has decided in this case. I want to bring in Deborah Roberts ABC's Deborah Roberts, a mom, first and foremost, and a veteran correspondent here. But Deborah, you were telling us that it's a conversation that you had in your family with your children just in the last 24 hours about how the country, how the world might react to this.
That's right, David. And I'd have to tell you, when you all alluded to the videotape, as Steve Osunsami talked about, that was so much clearer and so much more impactful this time. Yesterday, watching those closing arguments and seeing so much of that excruciating videotape just sort of, I think, took us all back to last summer when this case just struck everybody. And if you have blood running through your veins, there's just no way you weren't impacted by that videotape. And just hearing those cries of George Floyd calling for his mother. I mean, there was something that was so primal and so difficult about that. And I did interviews last year with moms talking about how that affected them. And of course, of so many of us having conversations, as Terry said, with our children. And I had a conversation with my own 18-year-old son about it. And I have to tell you, it was emotional for me hearing him talk about how fearful he was after seeing something like that. And even right now, he can't even look at it. He turns away from this tape, seeing this man's final minutes on this earth. So I think there's something about that tape that just struck at everyone. And I think while we all know that, you can't predict the jury, and there are going to be people, as Terry said, who may feel like the jury got it wrong, there just seems to be sort of this united feeling in this country that there was something so terribly wrong that went on last year. And I think that people are just waiting. I mean, someone just posted on social media, I'm sick to my stomach waiting for this verdict. I think for so many people, this is the culmination of just an awful event that we have had to witness as people, with our children, as parents. And it has been something that has been very, very difficult. And I think that the weight of this verdict is sort of in play right here for so many of us who are dealing with this as parents, as well as just people who are watching what's going to happen. So you can't, I think, overstate the anxiety and the nervousness that people are feeling as they're waiting to see this come to a conclusion.
And Deborah, we of course have to remember that there is another family watching all of this all over again, and that's the family of George Floyd. And Deborah, I'm curious, a year later, with the context of all of the reporting now, that 9-minute video spoke volumes just by what we saw in the video, but given the context of the reporting and then what we've watched, because there was a live stream of the trial. So the country, the world watching, both sides make their cases, and with that additional context and with the very emotional testimony of those bystanders. I mean, we met just about everybody standing on that sidewalk just by watching this trial, and you have to wonder, and we'll learn which way the jury decides here in just a short time from now, but you have to wonder the impact of playing that video in the courtroom, not just for the family of George Floyd. It must have been excruciating to go through this all over again, but in those closing arguments, the decision by the prosecution, they went much shorter with the video than they did in the opening statement. On the flip side, the defense used quite a bit of the video with George Floyd on the ground, and I'll be curious to see what jurors decide from watching that video. In many ways, it was more difficult the second time around. And Judge Cahill now in the courtroom. Deborah, stand by, our entire team standing by. All rise for the jury. All right, please be seated. Members of the jury, I understand you have a verdict. Members of the jury, I will now read the verdicts as they will appear in the permanent records of the 4th Judicial District. State of Minnesota, County of Hennepin, District Court, 4th Judicial District, State of Minnesota Plaintiff versus Derek Michael Chauvin, Defendant. Verdict, count 1, court file number 27, CR 20-12646. We, the jury, in the above entitled matter as to count 1, unintentional second-degree murder while committing a felony, find the defendant guilty. This verdict agreed to this 20th day of April 2021 at 1:44 p.m. Signed, juror foreperson, juror number 19. Same caption, verdict count 2. We, the jury, in the above entitled matter as to count 2, third-degree murder perpetrating an eminently dangerous act, find the defendant guilty. This verdict agreed to this 20th day of April 2021 at 1:45 p.m. Signed by jury foreperson, juror number 19. Same caption, verdict count 3. We, the jury, in the above entitled matter as to count 3, second-degree manslaughter, culpable negligence, creating an unreasonable risk, find the defendant guilty. This verdict agreed to this 20th day of April 2021 at 1:45 p.m. Jury foreperson 019. Members of the jury, I'm now going to ask you individually if these are your true and correct verdicts. Please respond yes or no. Juror number 2, are these your true and correct verdicts?
Yes.
Juror number 9, are these your true and correct verdicts?
Yes.
Juror number 19, are these your true and correct verdicts?
Yes.
Juror number 27, are these your true and correct verdicts?
Yes.
Juror number 44, are these your true and correct verdicts?
Yes.
Juror number 52, are these your true and correct verdicts?
Yes.
Juror number 55, are these your true and correct verdicts?
Yes.
Juror number 79, are these your true and correct verdicts?
Yes.
Juror number 85, are these your true and correct verdicts?
Yes.
Juror number 89, are these your true and correct verdicts?
Yes.
Juror number 91, are these your true and correct verdicts?
Yes.
Juror number 92, are these your true and correct verdicts?
Yes.
Are these your verdicts, so say you one, so say you all?
Yes.
Members of the jury, I find that the verdicts as read reflect the will of the jury and will be filed accordingly. I have to thank you on behalf of the people of the state of Minnesota for not only jury service, but heavy-duty jury service. What I'm going to ask you to do now is to follow the deputy back into your usual room, and I will join you in a few minutes to answer questions and to advise you further. So, all rise for the jury. All right, be seated. With the guilty verdicts returned, we're going to have Blakely, you may file a written argument as to Blakely factors within 1 week. The court will issue findings on the Blakely factors, the factual findings, 1 week after that. We'll order a PSI immediately returnable in 4 weeks. And we will also have a briefing on, after you get the PSI, 6 weeks from now, and then 8 weeks from now, we will have sentencing. We'll get you the exact dates in a scheduling order. Is there a motion on behalf of the state?
The state would move to have the court revoke the defendant's bail and remand him into custody pending sentencing.
Bail is revoked, bond is discharged, and the defendant is remanded to the custody of the Hennepin County Sheriff. Anything further? All right. Thank you. So there you have it. The jury in Hennepin County in Minneapolis finding Derek Chauvin guilty on all 3 counts: second-degree unintentional murder, third-degree murder, and second-degree manslaughter. Guilty in all 3. You can see him being led away there in the courtroom. He had been out on bail. You heard the state request of the judge that bail be revoked and that he be taken into custody, which is exactly what the judge decided to do. You can see the counts up on your screen right now. The jury deliberating yesterday afternoon and then began deliberating again early this morning, but it was a short period of time before we learned that they had come to a unanimous conclusion. Clearly, they thought that the case made by the prosecution and perhaps that final closing argument, that rebuttal from Jerry Blackwell when he said to the jury, it's as simple as what that 9-year-old girl, one of the bystanders, said that she heard the paramedics say when they arrived there more than 9 minutes after that knee was put to George Floyd's neck. She said that she heard paramedics say, get off of him. Of course, in the hours and the days to come, we will learn more from that jury, what they were thinking over the course of this 3-week trial. But we wanted to look at the reaction coming in from Minneapolis. This was the scene in South Minneapolis just moments ago. They had described the sound of people gathering there, obviously erupting. Embracing one another, and in many ways for that community and for the people who have gathered there, it has been an extraordinarily long year in this country. This was the scene again, George Floyd Square. This is the reaction from the families, George Floyd's family, with their legal team, Ben Crump, we know, leading that team, clearly overjoyed. They believe justice has been served in this case. Derek Chauvin found guilty on all counts. And I want to bring in our chief legal analyst, Dan Abrams, as we look at these images. Clearly, the pause there is in between each count as the judge was reading from that piece of paper delivered to him by the foreperson of the jury. And Dan, guilty on all counts. They believe the prosecution made its case beyond a reasonable doubt.
Yep, on each and every charge. And remember that there are slightly different theories with regard to second-degree murder and third-degree murder. I mean, there was a possibility that he could be found guilty of second-degree murder, not of third-degree murder, and then guilty of second-degree manslaughter. That didn't happen. This was a prosecution clean sweep here. And now Derek Chauvin will be sentenced on the highest charge, which is second-degree murder, faces up to 40 years. The sentencing guidelines in Michigan suggest more likely 10 to 15 years. But I'll tell you, David, you mentioned that 9-year-old girl, and she could be relevant in the context of sentencing because prosecutors can ask for what's called an enhancement in the sentencing, meaning to go beyond what the guidelines would suggest because a child was present. And so that 9-year-old girl was not just an emotional witness, but she could become a very important witness with regard to the potential sentence that Derek Chauvin gets. You heard him, the judge then referring to the Blakely standard, and that means basically start preparing for the argument over sentencing. And that will be the next phase of this case to determine what the sentence for Derek Chauvin will be. But at this point, certainly a big win for the prosecution in this case, getting everything that they asked this jury for.
Just to drill down on that point, Dan, as per Minnesota state law, the jury will decide, the judge will decide sentencing on the highest of the charges, which of course is unintentional second-degree murder. The presumed sentence is usually 10 to 15 years, but he faces up to 40 years. And as you mentioned, the state will ask for what's called an aggravated sentence here, and he could face decades behind bars.
Absolutely. And, I think that is going to be, really the next big debate in this case over exactly what should be the sentence for Derek Chauvin. Again, as we talked about when the jury reached its verdict and we said they came back so quickly, this is not good news for Derek Chauvin. Again, on the sentencing side, I wouldn't want to be Derek Chauvin either, meaning that, typically, and it's not just typically, it's really the vast majority of cases where you're talking about second-degree murder or third-degree murder. You are talking about up to 15 years. But in this case, based on a number of factors, I expect the prosecution to ask for more time, and the judge will have to determine that. And David, I want to just add one other quick point, which is about the diversity of this jury. And I think it's important because we often talk about diversity and it sounds like a concept as opposed to something that can actually instill a sense of confidence in people about a verdict. The fact that there were 4 people who were African American on that jury, there were 2 who described themselves as multiracial, 6 whites, and they all came together and very quickly agreed on this verdict. This was a jury of peers, and as a result, I think that that's helpful in instilling confidence in the verdict for the community at large.
And Sonny Hostin, as we look at these images coming in from across the country, but first, of course, from Minneapolis, relief in that community. And you yourself said, as a former prosecutor yourself, when you heard that there was a verdict and this quickly, that even you had thought there would be at least questions from perhaps the jurors for the judge, and there was not. Unanimous, guilty on all charges.
Yeah. You know, David, I've been a lawyer for 27 years, and I remember when I was in law school during my first year, the Rodney King verdict came out, and it was an acquittal for 4 officers who, on video, beat and stomped and tased beat a man 56 times with a baton. And I believed my eyes then. So I believed my eyes this time with George Floyd. And even though I knew that fast verdicts always hint at an agreement, even though all of my training told me that they likely convicted on at least the highest count or at least the lowest count, because of the history in this country, because it is so rare that police officers are convicted, because Black men and Black boys are killed by police with impunity in this country, and that is just the truth, at a rate 5 times more than their white counterparts. Because I am the mother of an 18-year-old boy who is now in South Africa, and I feel that he is safer in South Africa than he is in his own country. I am so relieved that this is what justice finally looks like for my community. And while I know that this does not bring George Floyd back to his family, to his loved ones, to his brother, who we've heard from so eloquently, at least I believe now that the movement that we've seen since his murder on video for the world to see is not just a moment. I really believe that this is a movement that we've seen. And for that, I am so very thankful that perhaps we will see real change, much needed change in this country.
Sonny Hostin with some very personal reflections on our coverage this afternoon and the guilty verdict from the jury in Minneapolis. Sonny, thank you. And when you couple what Sonny said and her observations along with what Dan Abrams said just moments before her, that perhaps this could be a unifying moment when you think about the jury and the diversity, the makeup of that jury. 6 white jurors, 6 people of color, 4 Black jurors, and 2 who self-identify as multiracial, that they all deliberated together and in just a short period of time were united on what they saw when they watched those 9 minutes and what they heard over the course of 3 weeks inside that Minneapolis courtroom. You can see they have begun to put up signs in Minneapolis. That's the scene from South Minneapolis. Justice served is what that sign says underneath George Floyd's name now. They've now put that up on the sign, and my colleague, Lindsay Davis, is in Minneapolis. And Lindsay, the reaction there.
David, you know, there was a novel by Terry McMillan, subsequently a movie called Waiting to Exhale. Today it was so much more than that. That was all of us. And just a little while ago, I was telling you about how the streets here were empty. You hardly saw any people or cars. Well, suddenly now you hear just this celebratory honking. I saw a small group of Black people walk by who chanted Black Lives Matter. And certainly, this verdict doesn't change our criminal justice system, but perhaps for some, at least for this day, if nothing more beyond that, it does send this message. And for those who consider this to be a win or a victory, perhaps they owe a debt to Darnella Frazier, the 17-year-old who shot that video, because so much was made of the prosecution's saying, but for the knee, right? And I imagine many today are saying, but for the videotape, would we find ourselves in this place today? After all, if we go back to how this started, all with a counterfeit $20 bill, a crime that Chief Arredondo testified that normally they wouldn't even take somebody into custody for. So much jubilation really on the streets here.
Lindsay Davis on the ground in Minneapolis for us as we continue our live coverage of the verdict in the trial of former Minneapolis police officer Derek Chauvin. He was a veteran with the police force there in Minneapolis. A 19-year veteran, 45 years old. He's been found guilty of second-degree unintentional murder, guilty of third-degree murder, guilty of second-degree manslaughter. We're getting some color from inside that courtroom, and of course the live stream offers the country and the world a perspective that we would not have seen had we not been in this pandemic. The judge saying he was doing this live stream because the community would not be allowed to come into the courtroom and witness at this trial as it unfolded. But some of what we can't see in that courtroom has just come in, and this is from the print reporter who was inside the courtroom. They're allowing a reporter or two inside that courtroom every day, but because of restrictions, just a small number of reporters. They described the scene as the judge said, "All rise." The jurors entering that courtroom, we are told all of them looked serious. None of them looked emotional, or that they had been teary, or that there had been emotions exchanged while they were deliberating. All of them, in this note that we've been given by the print reporter who was in the room, serious as they walked into the courtroom. Judge Cahill reading the verdicts on that paper as Chauvin stared at the empty witness podium. And as you saw at home, as we were carrying this live, this is the era that we're in, the face mask. There was very little reaction unless you're reading the eyes of Derek Chauvin. And I do believe we have video of the actual moment. You won't be able to see much, but here's what we saw.
Permanent records of the 4th Judicial District. State of Minnesota, County of Hennepin, District Court, 4th Judicial District. State of Minnesota plaintiff versus Derek Michael Chauvin, defendant. Verdict, count 1. Court file number 27, CR 20-12646. We, the jury, in the above entitled matter as to count 1, unintentional second-degree murder while committing a felony, find the defendant guilty. This verdict agreed to this 20th day of April 2021 at 1:44 p.m. Signed, juror foreperson, juror number 19.
And that's the reaction from Derek Chauvin as he went through each of the counts.
Above entitled matter as to count 2,
as you can see.
Third-degree murder, perpetrating an eminently dangerous act, find the defendant guilty. This verdict agreed to this 20th day of April 2021 at 1:45 p.m. Signed by jury foreperson, juror number 19. Same caption, verdict count 3. We, the jury, in the above entitled matter as to count 3, second-degree manslaughter, culpable negligence, creating an unreasonable risk, find the defendant guilty. This verdict agreed to this 20th day of April 2021 at 1:45 p.m. Jury foreperson 019. Members of the jury, I'm now
going to ask you, Derek Chauvin, his reaction inside that courtroom, of course wearing a mask, which makes it very difficult
juror number 2
for anyone to truly judge at home what the reaction was, though it seemed rather stoic, calm, and as he was led away from the courtroom, no resistance. And that was in the note that he stood up, that certainly his defense attorney prepared him for the very likely scenario that if he was found guilty, that the state would ask the judge to revoke bail, which is exactly what they did. And of course, Given his background in law enforcement, he knew that was very likely what would happen if found guilty on really any of the charges. Those are the descriptions from inside the courtroom, and of course we'll learn more in the hours and the days to come. One of the things that we were struck by today is that even before this verdict was delivered by this jury in Minneapolis, we heard from President Biden at the White House weighing in on this case, and he said he was
now
only
check
weighing
this out,
in
right?
offering
Yeah,
what he
it's
did,
4:20 time. I gotta
because
go.
he knew that the jurors in this
Check it
case
out.
had been sequestered and would not hear
I'm
what the
going to a
president was
420
saying.
party.
The White House revealing today that he did call the family of George Floyd in the last
I'm going to a
24 hours. And I want to bring in our
party.
chief White House correspondent,
I ain't
Cecilia
going to
Vega,
smoke.
because
I'm
Cecilia,
going
you were
to
telling
network.
me just before we came on this afternoon that we were actually expecting to hear
say?
from President Biden.
I love you
that was put on
guys.
hold, and
And I'm going
we
to end this
obviously
video by
assumed
saying
it was
this,
because
man.
the White House knew this was coming. Not
Just like they celebrating George Floyd's, the officer's guilty verdict. I pray to God, man. I pray to God. And when R. Kelly go to court and he get his day in court and they scream they're not guilty, I hope they give him that same news coverage. For real, once and for all, for real. When R. Kelly get found not guilty, give him that same energy they gave him when they was trying to convict the man for some bullshit. And I'm gonna leave like that. And I'll holler at y'all later. Hey, Larry. And let me say something to Larry, bitch ass. Hey, Larry, let me say something to you, man. You motherfuckers been screaming I'm a bum. Nigga, you is a bum. You's a sorry ass, deadbeat ass daddy. You neglected your daughter. Your wife was a stripper. You bought her. Everything you got, you ain't earning or work for it. You still use Janine to scam and fondle your illegal activities. You ain't learned your lesson, and I can't wait till your bitch ass go to jail. Now free R. Kelly on that, you bitch ass nigga. And I'm out of here.